the first question, which is your definition of field research.
Well, I think field research is any kind of study of human beings that involves either direct observation of them or direct talking to them, or both, but without using any formal instrument, though they may come in. That's not essential to field research. And this may be done either under the auspices of some outside body or the company, if that's industrial, or you may do it by what we call participant observation, that is, just going in on your own.
How have you decided to do a field research project in the past? What made it interesting for you to start a project, and when did you feel it was appropriate to pursue a problem that interested you, a theoretical problem in the field?
Well, not so the theoretical problem. It's purely an empirical problem. After the war, previous to that, I'd done a lot of research, but after the war, for instance, I thought it was time to do some research on clerical workers, but simply because nobody had done any research on clerical workers.
And what, in your first times you went into the field, what were some of the typical problems you faced, the typical learning experiences, the critical issues, whether they were ethical or the types of skills you had to develop in the field?
Well, actually the first, if you take it, the first field research that I was responsible for was a study of steel workers out in Newcastle, Pennsylvania, who were unemployed. And the problem I ran into was not talking to the steel workers. We'd gotten an introduction to their leaders from the Steel Workers Union, but the fact that stupidly I had said that I was, which I was, from the Harvard Business School. And there was something called the Greater Newcastle Association, which is the Chamber of Commerce, that said, what is this character doing here from the Harvard Business School? And went to back to the Harvard Business School to find out if I was legit.
And what did they find out?
They found out I was legit, but in the meanwhile, they thought that I was a spy of some kind. Mm-hmm. And Newcastle was in bad shape at that time.
What about your early experiences with Elton Mayo in the Boston VA, was it?
No, it was the then called the Boston Dispensary. It's now, I guess, the New England Medical Center down on Washington Street in what is now the combat zone. And he'd gotten permission from a guy called Dr. Joe Platt, who was high in the organization. I don't know whether he's head of it or not, who had run something called a thought control clinic. There are always a large number of people that come into a hospital that have nothing wrong with them that the doctors can find, and it must be, they thought, psychological. Pratt's, not Platt's, thought control clinic got them in, and they discussed their common problems. And it went on from that to Pratt, who was a friend of Mayo's, saying, we will pick out people that our doctors say have no medical troubles, and your students can interview them in the dispensary, wearing white coats and so on, not looking like doctors, but not saying we were doctors. With our only instructions, we'd already read a lot of Freudian and other psychology, was to ask the patients to talk about anything they wanted, but basically we would ask them to try to talk about their own lives, particularly their early lives.
What did you do specifically in that setting? What did you learn from that setting?
Well, I learned to carry out what we'd been taught by God knows enough reading and discussion, how to carry out a version of what's called non-directive interviewing.
And can you explain what non-directive interviewing is?
Non-directive interviewing is all explained in a chapter of Roethlisberger and Dixon called Management and the Worker. And I don't think I could do it better than that. And that is that you essentially leave the patient to say what he wants. You don't interfere. You don't try to tell him what to say, but simply follow up and back him up on what he or she wants to talk about.
What kind of teacher was Mayo? What kind of person was he to work with, and how did he shape the type of research and your ideas about field research?
Well, he was a devotee of field research, and in the sense that he was which is a very special kind, I suppose, of field research. He was a psychiatrist, and he had known in Brisbane, Australia, at least two famous field researchers in anthropology who must have talked to him about field research. One of them was Bronislaw Malinowski, and the other one was Arthur Radcliffe Brown.
And Roethlisberger and Dixon, did they all work closely together in the years that you were there? What kind of teachers were they?
The Western Electric research was in the main lines of it, not the company's own later research program, but the Harvard-directed part of it was coming to an end when I first knew Mayo, though I did go out a couple of times to Hawthorne. I never did any work there.
How did they get in touch and decide to do the actual Hawthorne work? What was it? Do you know any of the history behind that?
I don't know, but it began as somebody else's work. I've forgotten just who it was. It's written up in Roethlisberger and Dixon's, Roethlisberger's autobiography, and Mayo, when he came to Harvard, took it over, more or less, yeah. I don't know what the reason for the shift was.
You had done the Boston-Edison study many years later in the 50s, is that right?
Oh, much later, yes. That was after World War II.
What had you been doing in the meanwhile with regard to field research?
I'd been at sea for 5 years.
Mm-hmm. In the war?
Yes, commanding ships.
Mm-hmm. And you came back and you started doing field research again, and was the Boston-Edison study
well,
the first study?
almost right away. I couldn't do it immediately, but I did it. I think I got back in '46. I was kept on longer than I should have been by the Navy because I was considered a military necessity, which I've never wholly understood, but it was very flattering. I didn't get back till '46, and I didn't get rolling on field work, really, though I did some work on wildcat strikes out in Pennsylvania, out in Detroit. I didn't really get going on my own field research until 1950.
Can you describe your Boston-Edison study? Some of the things you learned from that?
Well, I learned two main things. One of them was a very, very obvious thing, strangely enough, and that was that, which we knew already, that there were certain groups that were more productive than others, and we had data on this. And social life seemed to be connected to some extent with productivity. But I think the greatest discovery I have made at the Boston-Edison Company was that the more you talked, the more productive you were. The company had a rule that the girls shouldn't talk while they were doing this particular job, but they all did. Nobody tried to stop them. And I counted the number of times they talked. That is, I took a sample of the number of times they talked, and I found the number of times they talked correlated very highly with their production of whatever they were doing, which was, in fact, what they call pulling cash, which meant that they were taking the stubs of bills and matching them up with a billing card so that under that current system, the customer wouldn't be billed twice. This showed that he paid his bill for the last month.
You had mentioned an interesting story that how you were woven into the social network of that company. As you mentioned being a master of ceremonies, given the title.
Yeah, I was, without trying to do it at all. All I'd done was to sit in the back of the room and watch, occasionally wander around and talk to people, and learning all the different kinds of jobs, and also observing interactions between workers. And then there was a time when I regularly interviewed everyone, but it was a rule. It seems hard to believe in the Boston-Edison in those days that if you got married, you had to leave. It was a very Catholic company. And so girls, these were pretty young women, were always leaving. And we put on decorated their little desks and gave them presents and flowers and so on. And they didn't want to ask the bosses, and I was available, so they asked me to present presents, and worst of all, to pin a flower on the heaving breasts of these young women. You know. And that was, I didn't try to do this. This was their idea.
So you got the title of Master of Ceremonies.
I became a Master of Ceremonies. I wasn't ever labeled that, but that's what I was.
You had mentioned you'd interviewed somebody from Boston-Edison, and then you went back to talk to them a second time, and they had no memory of the interview?
Yes, there was some, they were mostly women that worked in this was the Customers Accounting Division, so-called, and there were some men that worked in the division. And one of them was an older man who had been there for a long time. I asked everyone whether they were willing to be interviewed. It was on company time. They varied very much in length, from about an hour to about 3 hours. This particular man had agreed to be interviewed, and I interviewed him. It seemed like a perfectly reasonable standard interview. I always started off with what's your job like, and then went on in a non-directive fashion. And after it was over, he went to see the local medical people. They had some in the company, and said he'd completely forgotten what he'd said to me. And he had. Though I couldn't figure out what I'd said, or he had said, that was threatening in any way, if that was the reason.
You had done some work at the Ford Motor Company also.
Yes, this was slightly before the Boston-Edison Company.
What did you do at Ford?
Well, we were interested in the wildcat strikes. There was an epidemic of them right after the end of World War II in 47 and 48. And two of us were sent out by Mayo to see what we could find out. We didn't find out very much, because we always, wildcat strike, you don't know when it's going to start. And so we usually showed up after it was well underway, whereas we'd have liked to see the conditions under which we started. But one of the people I interviewed was a foreman in the Ford River Rouge plant, and I interviewed him at home, and he was a pretty good interview, very nice fellow, had a good time with him, except that he had a most outlandish pet, which is in fact a snapping turtle, and a snapping turtle is the most dangerous animal in eastern North America. It has a long neck that can extend and take a real big bite out of you. And he had this animal wandering around the floor in his living room while I was interviewing him. So I pulled up a chair, and even though that wouldn't have saved me from the snapping turtle if it had been mad, and put my feet up on it while the snapping turtle wandered around the floor.
So you
I
had,
wasn't bitten, no harm done. I was a nice snapping turtle.
so in a sense, some of the skills you developed through your years is defensive skills, how to protect yourself from attack by pets while doing interviews.
Well, I don't know about attack from pets. That's the only pet I remember being scared of. I was terrified of it. But I went through my interview. I used to be entertained by other kinds of stories. One of the groups I was interested in at the Boston-Edison Company were the meter readers. And they were, whereas most of the other clerks are women, they were men. And they used to show more or less as signs of marks of distinction or wound stripes or whatever you want to call them, the fact that they'd been bitten all up and down their legs by dogs. Meter reading is a dangerous profession.
What was your style of keeping notes and at least quantifying the data at the end of the day?
In those days, there were recording machines, but you'd be surprised how much advance we've made since then. But I decided, and many other people decided, that they would make people nervous if we had them in interviews. So I took no notes or had any piece of paper or pencil before me, no recorder, but immediately after the interview I typed as rapidly as I could what I remembered of the interview, and you could remember a great deal if you tried. Now, whether it was accurate or not, of course you can't be sure.
How did you generally enter an organization? You mentioned you enter at the top.
I always ended as near the top as I could. I couldn't always enter at the top, but for instance, in Newcastle, Pennsylvania, we started with Phil Murray, who was the head of the Steelworkers Union, and in the same way, when we worked in the Boston-Edison Company, we started with the vice president in charge of public relations, something like that, to whom we'd been introduced by the business school, and gradually worked down to where we were going to talk to people, explaining at every level what we were trying to do. And this would be true of the union. I started, if possible, if they had a union, as near to the top and sometimes really at the top as I could.
You had suggested when we talked last about how important it is to use a combination of different methods. The interview with the survey method, the observation with the interview, and you had mentioned Seashore had done a large work along those lines.
Well, Seashore, I've forgotten the title of his book, did a big survey of plant. Did it by regular survey methods, which I don't consider fieldwork methods, in a steel company that had about some 2,000 workers, and you obviously couldn't make a field study of all of them, but all they did was to make a survey, and they got some findings that were interesting. One of them was that the larger the number of intergroup choices there were, the more likely the group was to show what I thought was some sign of group control of output. Now, maybe you can explain that without having gone to see the group, but I think it would have helped a lot if, together with the survey research, they'd also taken a couple, 3, 4 groups and made intensive field studies of them, so we'd really know what some of these findings meant. One of the findings was that the higher the status of a group as far as pay and so on are concerned, the more likely they were to exercise control over output. And just why these should be connected, I think we'd have learned a lot more about if we'd done some field studies.
You think some of Skinner's work, for instance, his writing in Walden 2, is reflective of his even...
He's not a field worker.
Have people been employing his...
And Walden 2 wouldn't work as it did, as he said it would. Fred is an old friend of mine, and I've always told him that if he ever set up a Walden 2, I'd like to come along as a field observer, because I knew it wouldn't work the way he said it would.
Why do you think it wouldn't work?
Because there are a whole lot of things that he paid no attention to, that as a result of having done field work, I knew about it. He apparently didn't see how important they were. One of them was how you handle status. And he assumed that in this society, everybody was going to be equal, in spite of the fact that there were big differences in responsibility in Walden 2. And in fact, no alleged Walden 2 has ever worked the way Fred Skinner said it would. It's one of his worst books. Entertaining, but bunk.
Have any of his ideas been used in field research?
Oh, you can hardly help using them in field research. That is to say, you find people behaving according to the law of effect. That is, if you if you send a man to a foreman training school and tell him to behave in a certain very nice way towards workers, and then put him back into the company and note that no change has been made in the old situation, he will revert to his behavior as it was before he'd been trained, because that's more rewarding. That's perfectly good Skinner. I'm not saying Skinner's always wrong, far from it, but Walden 2 is for the birds. I used to make my students in a class I gave for years write papers on Walden 2, explaining why it would or would not work. But my belief is it wouldn't work. I don't think any of these experiments that claim to be Skinnerian, that are social experiments, have worked. He's a good experimental psychologist, but not a very good social psychologist.
What kind of training skills did you emphasize when you were teaching young researchers how to do field research?
Well, basically, I taught them to go in there and keep their mouths shut. That's my doctrine. That's what non-directive interviewing is. You go in and, first of all, there are some obvious things you've got to do. You've got to explain, unless you're doing one of these studies where you just go in as a worker yourself and write down what you remember, you have to be very careful to explain to them what you're going to do and why you're going to do it. And if they don't go along with your plan, why, you better stop there, because they'll stop you anyhow. The next thing you do is to assure them that nothing will be published unless they consent, which in my case I've always done, and people will be disguised. And then the next thing you do, strangely enough, is not to start talking to people, but to learn all of the operations. Not so that you can do them as well as the workers can, but at least know what they're doing and what the system is, the actual, what the department or other is supposed to do with what machinery or and so on, and learn the operations. So you know what they're about, at least. And then what I always did was spend part of my time in the I'd like to have a room where I could see what was going on all over it. That was one of the reasons for choosing a place, so it wasn't broken up by walls and so on. I spent part of my time observing what went on, and part of my time wandering around and talking to people, passing the time of day, not trying to push myself into any apparently private conversations or to bring up matters that they didn't want to bring up, and then finally conducting formal interviews, but not with a schedule, but non-directive.
It must be difficult to develop the line between trust and intrusiveness. How do you just have to develop a sense for when you're intruding too much and when you should back off?
Oh, we usually can tell from experience of ordinary life when you're barging into a conversation or not.
You had compared the field researcher almost to a natural historian. If you could talk about that.
Well, in the sense that all of these sharpies around here used to talk about, Thurstone methods of statistics and experimental methods in social psychology and so on. I was the only man who used to give a lecture on how the natural historian who is watching a bird behaves. And there is a marvelous example of what can be done by this, by simple observation, and it's been done many times since, but in those days the best example was a fellow called Blanck in England who wrote A Life of the Robin, which is a social life of the robin, not our robin, but the English robin, which is a different bird.
You devoted a whole lecture period to describing this novel and how that is an example?
It isn't a novel. It's a full book called The Life of the Robin.
Mm-hmm. And what does he do in that book?
Well, he describes, for instance, how two robins work out territories, which has now become a commonplace, and things like that. But he did it all with a pair of field glasses.
When was he doing his writing?
Well, this is in the 50s. I don't know whether I have it with me here. David Blanck, The Life of the Robin, won him a fellowship of the English Royal Academy of Science.
What do you find most satisfying about doing field research, personally satisfying?
Well, I liked associating with people under these circumstances, and they've usually been very, very nice to me, and it's been good fun talking to them, and most of them have been willing to talk. In fact, one of the things I discover is that a lot of people have had no attention at all, ever paid to them, as if they were counted for a damn, whereas I sat down with them for 2 or 3 hours. Now that's quite an experience. And I enjoyed, finally, after I became accepted, which I usually did, after a while, I enjoyed the pure social life and the gossip that went on, entirely apart from the more formal things that I was doing.
Did you know Bill White when he was in
Sure,
there?
he was a great friend of mine.
What did you think of the work he was doing at the time?
Oh, because he was doing field work before I was. Because I got involved in medieval history, which is a very different kind of thing, while he was interviewing men in the North End.
Did you talk to him about the development of it? Did you know him when he was just starting to go into the North End?
Sure.
What sort of problems was he facing, or how did that study evolve, if you know that?
Well, I don't know, but he has an extra chapter on the end of one of his editions that describes this, so you can find out, but I've forgotten. But the trouble always comes at the very beginning to get people to know you. And in Newcastle, Pennsylvania, it was quite easy because my method of sampling, if that's what it was to, we were working through the Steelworkers Union. The union would tell us an unemployed worker that might be a likely person to talk to, so I'd go and talk to him, and then would ask, now, who would you suggest that I go and see?
It seemed like after White's book came out, Peter Blau then came out with the next.
Well, that was a long time after, because Peter Blau's was just a very good piece of field work. Didn't come out till 1950 sometime, I think.
But that seemed to represent a whole new way of looking at field research, more scientific, more quantitatively oriented. What are your feelings on that?
I don't think there's, put it that way, more quantitatively oriented. I don't think the quantitative part of Peter Blau's book really made any difference.
What do you think is interesting
And
about it?
I'd done some quantitative work in my study of Boston-Edison, which was before, maybe contemporary with Peter, but I did some minor quantitative work there, counting interactions.
There are many field research studies done in that time period. What really differentiated Blau's and White's work from the rest of the pack? Those are the two that you really hear about. Those are the prototypical examples that are given in sociology courses.
Well, those are the ones that are seen, at least to me, because I have used both of them to get at possible generalizations that interested me.
What would be an example of that?
Well, you know, the relationship in Bill White's book between the social rank of the individuals and things like the way they scored at, what was it, bowling. Yeah.
What about
The relation between social organization and other things. And in Blau's book, the interest was in the fact that how you got status in the group, which is, of course, a very important thing in any small group.
and what's your opinion of the field research that's coming out today and the future of field research? It seems that people are, with the onset of the computer age and with people just sending out more and more questionnaires and coming back and raking through the data without doing much observation. What is your feelings on
I don't think they're doing any field research, with the possible exception of some of the anthropologists. But I haven't run into, though it may be simply because I'm getting old and don't read as many books as I used to, I haven't run into any piece of field research that I consider really terribly exciting.
And what would, if you could imagine what would be an exciting piece of field research for you, what would be an example of that? Not a particular book, but what would strike you, something new or something that you haven't thought about before? What would be interesting or exciting?
Well, it's an obvious question. Go for the kinds of places in American or other life that haven't been studied. And I want to know how a computer organization or design or construction and both works.
And what about even more to the moment? Take an example of Reagan's differing attitude towards the rich and the poor.
Rich and the poor, his differing attitudes. Well, since
Or the
they're
impact.
roughly equivalent to my differing attitudes, I'm not particularly interested in that.
What
I think I know the differences between the rich and the poor. Rich and the poor are much more alike than they seem, except for money, which has often been said, including Hemingway and others.
Are there any other anecdotal stories that you'd like to mention? I had gone through most of the things we had talked about. Your feelings on the future of field research in the social sciences?
Well, all I can say is I wish more people would do it. Some of my students have done it. but it hasn't been published. I had a student who studied a very interesting kind of thing. His idea was to look at organizations that are run by the workers themselves instead of by bosses. And one of the interesting cases is the garbage collectors in a number of places in this country. And he really went out with the garbage haulers. And it was a very good piece of field work, I thought, but he never hasn't yet published it. And then back many years ago, there's a lot of very good unpublished field work. I had a student who made studies simply by going and getting a job there of a agricultural machinery operation, one department of a big plant. Never been published. It's too bad.
And what about a film like this? Do you think it's a waste of time? That we should really be, if we're interested in field research, just get out in the field research, in the field and do it? Or do you think this can be useful to help people, at least make them more aware of the types of issues that field researchers are facing?
Well, I thought, you can't tell until, if you wanted to make a test, try somebody in the field who's been exposed to this and somebody who hasn't. But that's the only way I guess you have of telling, and maybe that wouldn't tell you.
See,
but I don't think it'll do them any harm, put it that way. And I certainly learned from the basic rules of non-directive interviewing, which is certainly part of field research, from reading, after all, which is not field research itself.
But there are no longer the great mentors around anymore that are doing field research to teach the younger.
I know, that's bad, and we have that problem in other areas. Latin is no longer taught, and therefore medieval history is going to disappear.
Well, I think I covered basically
If you care about that. I do.
Is field research going to disappear?
No. I think people will continue to do field research. It's very rewarding, I think, in its own right. The trouble is that it's expensive. It takes a lot of time for what you get. And there's always the question that bothers the statisticians, but doesn't bother me, is whether you're getting something very atypical or not. I think that anything you get about the behavior of people is interesting, whether it's typical or not. As the great Lord Nelson said, though this is a metaphor, when he was going into battle at Trafalgar, he said to his ship captains, no one can go far wrong who lays his ship alongside one of the enemies. That's my view about field research, except they're not enemies.
You had mentioned that you were in the Navy for 6 years. Were you a captain of a ship? Or?
Oh, I was captain of 3 different ships. My rank wasn't captain, but captain is the title you have if you're in fact in command.
Uh-huh. And did you learn anything from that experience? Obviously, there were a lot of things going on, but...
I certainly did, and one thing I learned was, which of course you don't learn from ordinary field research, and that is the isolation, the social isolation of a commanding officer. People are scared of you. Perhaps they shouldn't have been, but in one of our convoy runs, which is from Trinidad down to a place called Recife in Brazil, all the ship captains in the escort group, we were escorting a group of merchant ships, we'd get together at the local bar, and everybody would say, nobody loves me on my ship, George. And I would say, how true, you know, and that. But again, you did learn some things which are very much like field research, and that is, for God's sake, don't do things in a hurry. Wait I got into more trouble by deciding like that than by doing anything else.
Did you ever use this personal experience in the Navy to apply it towards research?
Well, I wrote a book called, a little paper called The Small Warship, which is a bloody good study.
And what did you talk about in that study?
Well, you look at it and read it. Why should I have to tell you? I don't remember what I said.
No, I was thinking in terms of applying your personal experiences towards studying top executives, let's say, because there is a lot of...
Oh, yeah, I haven't done that. But what I really learned was the same thing that non-directive interview teaches you, but you always find it hard to carry out, and especially hard to carry out when you're carrying the responsibility, which you're not, of course, when you're doing ordinary field work. So I made several snap judgments, and they backfired on me. In fact, the whole engine room crew once asked me for an interview, which I held with them, and they had a grievance, which was a legitimate grievance in a way, and then anyhow had something important to it, and I had made a decision about it that was the wrong decision, and then they came to me, and then they and I talked it over, and we reached a compromise. But I never should have made a snap decision in the first place. Of course, you have to make some snap decisions, but they're not necessarily snap decisions about people. You have to make snap decisions about which side of a buoy you're going to go on, or whatever it may be, but not about people.
And were you ever in battle in these situations with these people?
That is the interesting thing. I never even heard a shot fired in anger. We were in anti-submarine convoying, but largely in the South Pacific area, which wasn't exactly an active area for submarines, though there were some around, but we never happened to run into any of them. So I never had to try to sink a submarine. I tried to sink what I thought was a submarine, but it turned out to be a reef over which a current was flowing, which makes sounds on the gear just like a moving submarine. And I dropped God knows how many $100,000 worth of U.S. depth bombs on that reef before we had sense enough to look at the chart and see where we were, which showed the reef. And my crew used to refer to that as Homans' folly. On the other hand, my little paper on the small warship, I got a letter of commendation from James Forrestal, then Secretary of Defense.
What did you, up to in the last 10 years or so, have you been doing any field research or writing in the area of field research?
I've been writing in the area of field research because a lot of my books are based on field research. Not always entirely on field research, but a lot of them.
On any particular subject in the last 10 years?
Well, one of the things I've been working on, particularly which came out of my field research, is the topic I call distributive justice. That is, how do people feel about things like wage differentials, you know? I call it distributive justice because that's what Aristotle called it. And it was a big issue in the Boston-Edison Company, in my department at least, between two different groups. So it's brought to my attention, and I've written a lot about that. It's amazing that until I got going on this, how little attention the social psychologists had paid to this obviously a terribly important problem. Always coming up. Can't avoid it.
Is that in trying to remember now? Is that in relation to social exchange theory also?
Oh, it's related to social exchange theory. Yeah.
You have written on that. How is that?
Well, that came out originally in my paper called Social Behavior as Exchange in 1958, and then it came out again in my same a bigger book called Social Behavior in '61, and then second edition in '74. But until I began talking about this, the social psychologists who aren't field workers, they're experimenters, so they don't find out what's important. That's one of the troubles with purely experimental work. Whereas you got your nose rubbed in it, and as soon as you're in industry, is my pay fair compared to X's pay? You know, one of the first things you hear people talk about. And not only absolutely high enough, but whether it's high enough compared to somebody else's. And these experimentalists, since they hadn't been out in the real world and discovered what people were really worried about, had never done any work on distributive justice, which they now call equity, though that's a very bad word for it. Now there are thousands of papers coming out on what's called equity theory. Most of them very bad, because very artificial experimental studies. Some very good ones, though.
Great. I think that covered everything I wanted to talk about. Is there anything else that you'd like to talk about?
Well, the great message, of course, is to watch and keep your mouth shut. You've got to do a certain amount of talking to help other people talk. But basically, don't try to barge in with your own ideas.
And certainly don't bring a filming crew in. Well, thank you. That was very interesting.
All right.